Chapter 18. Tensions Rise. The cool morning air clung to Mara and Kale like a shroud, failing to offer any comfort in the aftermath of their harrowing escape. Every breath they took was laced with the remnants of adrenaline, their hearts still pounding from the relentless fight for survival. The exhaustion was more than just physical, it seeped into their bones, heavy with the emotional toll of their ordeal. As they navigated the narrow, winding streets of the port city, the familiar surroundings that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed to close in on them, each corner and alleyway holding the potential for new dangers. Mara's steps were hurried and tense, her sharp gaze darting from shadow to shadow, as if expecting another ambush at any moment. Her usually confident stride was laced with an edge of frustration, the kind that had been simmering just below the surface ever since they had escaped the warehouse. The betrayal, the trap, and the chaos that had ensued left her on edge, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of anger and disillusionment. Every creak of wood and clatter of footsteps in the distance felt like a threat, amplifying the sense of unease that weighed heavily on her. Beside her, Kale moved with a more measured pace, his mind whirling with the implications of their recent encounter. The calculated calm that usually defined him was now laced with an undercurrent of tension. The strategic mindset that had guided them through countless challenges felt strained under the pressure of their escalating situation. His eyes were distant, focused inward as he grappled with the stark reality that their mission was unraveling at the seams. The weight of leadership was pressing down on him harder than ever, and he struggled to maintain his composure in the face of their deepening troubles. The tension between them was palpable, a silent but ever-present force that seemed to grow with every passing minute. The unspoken strain had been brewing for days, but their near-disastrous encounter in the warehouse had brought it to the surface with brutal clarity. The once seamless partnership between them now felt fragile, as if one wrong word or action could shatter it completely. Mara's frustration, usually well contained, had started to spill over, while Kale's steady demeanor was beginning to show cracks. As they continued to make their way through the city, the silence between them grew heavier, either one willing to be the first to break it. The early morning fog clung to the streets, muffling the sounds of the waking city and adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Every glance they exchanged was loaded with unspoken questions and doubts, each one a reminder of the growing distance between them. The mission that had once united them was now driving a wedge between them, threatening to tear apart the fragile connection they had built. Mara felt the tension in her muscles building, the frustration gnawing at her as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, a volatile mix of emotions that she was struggling to keep in check. The constant state of vigilance, the never-ending pressure, and the fear of betrayal had worn her down, and she could feel herself reaching a breaking point. Her mind was racing, filled with thoughts of what could have gone wrong, of the trust that had been shattered, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility that weighed on her shoulders. Kale was no less troubled, his thoughts similarly consumed by the events that had unfolded. He was a man of strategy and careful planning, but the chaos of the warehouse had thrown all of that into disarray. The realization that their allies might not be as trustworthy as they had believed was a blow to his confidence. The mission that had seemed so clear-cut was now mired in uncertainty, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into yet another trap. His royal upbringing had taught him to anticipate and navigate treacherous political landscapes, but this was something different, something far more dangerous. The tension between them finally reached a breaking point as they turned into a quieter street, the echoes of their footsteps the only sound in the eerie stillness. Mara stopped abruptly, her frustration boiling over as she spun to face Kale. "We can't keep going like this," she said, her voice tight with barely contained anger. "This mission is tearing us apart. We need to talk about what's happening, about what's really going on here, or we're not going to make it." Her words were a stark admission of the strain that had been building between them, a call for them to confront the growing divide. Cale met her gaze, his expression a mix of resolve and exhaustion. He knew she was right. They couldn't continue on this path without addressing the cracks that had begun to form in their partnership. But he also knew that the conversation they needed to have was going to be difficult, perhaps even painful. "I know," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "We've been through too much to let this mission destroy us. But we need to approach this carefully, to figure out how we can move forward without letting our emotions cloud our judgment." His response was a measured attempt to acknowledge the tension, while also urging caution, a reflection of his strategic mindset. The exchange marked a turning point, a tentative step towards addressing the issues that had been festering between them. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers both external and internal, but their willingness to confront their problems head-on was a crucial step in regaining the trust and unity they desperately needed. As they resumed their journey, the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but instead, with a shared understanding that they had to face their challenges together, if they were to have any hope of succeeding. Mara's mind churned with a tempest of frustration and anger, each thought sharper than the last. The recent betrayal had been a bitter pill to swallow, its sting lingering long after their narrow escape. The memory of the trap, its meticulously laid snares designed to ensnare them, gnawed at her pride and trust. The relentless pursuit by their enemies had frayed her nerves, leaving her on edge, her patience stretched thin. Every step forward felt heavy, as if the weight of their situation pressed down on her shoulders, each breath a struggle to maintain her composure in the face of overwhelming adversity. Yet it wasn't just the external threats that fueled her frustration. As much as she wanted to channel all her anger toward the conspirators, Mara couldn't ignore the growing tension between her and Cale. Their partnership, once so seamless and intuitive, now felt burdened by unspoken grievances and a silence that was more oppressive than the dangers they faced. The trust that had bound them together, that had allowed them to anticipate each other's moves in the heat of battle, now seemed to be unraveling, thread by thread. Every glance they exchanged was loaded with unspoken words, each one deepening the rift that had begun to form between them. Mara's thoughts circled back to the recent encounters that had driven a wedge between them. The near-disastrous trap had not only been a test of their physical endurance, but also of their emotional resilience. She could feel the strain in every interaction, the tension in every shared silence. The partnership that had once been their greatest strength now felt like a fragile alliance, threatened by the pressures of their mission and the heavy toll it had taken on both of them. The frustration that bubbled within her was as much about their shared struggles as it was about the enemies they faced. As they continued onward, the silence between them became unbearable, each step forward a reminder of the unresolved tension. Mara could sense the distance growing, not just in the physical space between them but in the emotional chasm that seemed to widen with every passing moment. She wanted to break through the wall of silence, to confront the issues head-on, but the words eluded her. The anger that simmered just beneath the surface threatened to spill over, but she struggled to find a way to express it without causing further harm to their already strained relationship. The path ahead was fraught with danger, both external and internal, and Mara knew that if they didn't address the issues that had begun to fester, their partnership might not survive the challenges to come. Her frustration was a storm waiting to break, but she also knew that letting it loose without careful consideration could do more harm than good. As they moved forward, the unspoken strain weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder that their greatest challenge might not be the enemies they faced, but the growing divide between them. Cale felt the heavy weight of their shared burdens pressing down on him with each step they took. His royal upbringing, which had long been a source of his calm composure, now seemed insufficient in the face of the relentless stress of their mission. The unyielding pressure bore down on him, testing the limits of his strategic mind and emotional resilience. The calculated plans and tactical decisions that had previously guided them through countless challenges now felt inadequate in the face of the growing rift between him and Mara. The subtle tension that had once been easy to overlook was now an undeniable force, threatening to undermine the foundation of their partnership. Every interaction with Mara seemed to be charged with unspoken tension. Cale could feel it in the sharpness of her words and the coldness in her gaze. He knew she was frustrated, not just with their enemies, but with him as well. The clarity and decisiveness that had once characterized their teamwork were now marred by discord. Cale struggled to maintain the level-headed approach that had always served him well, but every attempt to defuse the tension seemed to backfire. His measured responses were often met with Mara's sharp retorts, each one a reminder of the growing divide between them. The more he tried to hold on to his composure, the more he felt it slipping away. The situation was complicated by his deepening concern for Mara's well-being. He could see the toll the mission was taking on her, the way her patience frayed at the edges, and how her once steady resolve now seemed to waver under the strain. Cale wanted to reach out, to offer reassurance, but the words that came to mind felt inadequate. Each time he tried to bridge the gap, his efforts seemed to only exacerbate the tension, pushing them further apart instead of bringing them closer together. The mission itself, which had once been a unifying force between them, now felt like a wedge, driving them apart with every new challenge they faced. Cale knew that their success depended not just on their individual strengths but on their ability to work together, yet the growing discord threatened to unravel all they had worked for. The strategic acumen that had always been his greatest asset seemed less effective against the emotional complexities that now plagued their relationship. He found himself questioning his decisions, wondering if his attempts to maintain control were only making things worse. Despite his frustrations, Cale couldn't bring himself to give up on their partnership. He knew that the stakes were too high, that their mission was too important to allow personal conflicts to derail their efforts. But the path forward was unclear, and every misstep felt like a further erosion of the trust that had once bound them. The tension between them was a constant undercurrent, shaping every decision they made, every word they exchanged. Cale's concern for Mara was matched by his fear that they were losing sight of what had brought them together in the first place. As the days wore on, the silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken grievances and unresolved emotions. Cale could feel the strain in every glance, every moment of hesitation. He wanted to find a way to reconnect, to remind Mara that they were stronger together than apart, but the barriers between them seemed insurmountable. His royal training had prepared him for many things, but not for navigating the intricate web of emotions that now complicated their partnership. The stress of their mission, combined with the growing rift, left him feeling more isolated than ever. In the quiet moments between the chaos of their mission, Cale reflected on the changes that had come between them. The trust that had once seemed unshakable now felt fragile, and the bond that had been their greatest strength was strained to its breaking point. Yet, despite the growing tension, Cale remained determined to find a way forward. He knew that the challenges they faced required not just strategy and skill, but also a deep understanding of each other. As he looked at Mara, he resolved to find a way to bridge the gap, to restore the connection that had once made them an unstoppable team. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined not to let the strain of their mission destroy what they had built together. The quiet tension that had been simmering between Mara and Cale finally reached a boiling point as they took refuge in a small, dimly lit room. The space was cramped, the walls closing in on them, amplifying the unease that hung in the air. The single flickering lantern cast long shadows across the room, accentuating the lines of exhaustion etched into their faces. The silence between them was thick and palpable, a heavy presence that neither could ignore. They were both acutely aware of it, but neither was willing to be the first to break it, each lost in their own thoughts and frustrations. Mara paced restlessly, her movements sharp and agitated, a physical manifestation of the turmoil churning within her. Her mind raced through their next moves, each thought colliding with the next in a chaotic whirlwind of anger and determination. She had always been the one to charge forward, to confront obstacles head-on, but the recent events had left her feeling cornered and unsure. The betrayal, the near-fatal trap, the mounting pressure of their mission, it all weighed heavily on her. And now, the unspoken tension with Cale was like a splinter in her mind, a constant irritation she couldn't shake. Across the room, Cale sat in contemplative silence, his posture rigid, his face a mask of controlled emotion. He watched Mara's restless pacing, his own thoughts a tangled web of strategy and concern. He was trying to piece together their next steps, but the discord between them was like a persistent static, disrupting his usually clear thinking. Cale was used to handling pressure, to navigating complex political landscapes, but this was different. The strain on their partnership was something he hadn't anticipated, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The air was charged with unspoken words, each of them holding back what they truly wanted to say. The weight of their mission only added to the strain on their partnership, turning what had once been a seamless collaboration into a tense standoff. Mara could feel the unspoken grievances building up inside her, each one adding to the frustration that was threatening to spill over. She wanted to confront Cale, to demand answers, to challenge his approach, but something held her back. A part of her feared that once the dam broke, there would be no going back. Cale, too, was wrestling with his own frustrations. He could sense Mara's agitation, and it gnawed at him, but he wasn't sure how to address it. His royal upbringing had taught him to be measured, to think before he spoke, but in this moment, that restraint felt like a barrier between them. He knew that their mission depended on their ability to work together, yet the growing rift made him question every decision, every word. Cale felt the pressure mounting, the need to break the silence, to address the tension, but he hesitated, unsure of how to begin. The silence stretched on, each moment thickening the air between them. Mara's pacing grew more frantic, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She felt like a caged animal, trapped not just by their circumstances but by the unresolved issues between them. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to force Cale to engage with her, to acknowledge the strain they were both feeling. But she couldn't find the words. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, the weight of their situation pressed down on her, silencing her anger with the fear of what it might unleash. Finally, Mara couldn't take it any longer. She stopped in her tracks, her chest heaving with the effort to keep her emotions in check. "This isn't working," she said, her voice low but edged with frustration. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea all at once. She turned to face Cale, her eyes searching his for any sign of the connection they once shared. "We can't keep going like this, Cale. We need to talk to figure this out before it tears us apart." Cale looked up, meeting her gaze. Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating with the doubts he had been trying to suppress. He knew she was right. The tension between them was a ticking time bomb, threatening to explode at any moment. "I know," he replied quietly, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of their shared burden. "But it's not just about us anymore. The mission, everything we've worked for, it's all on the line. We can't afford to let our personal issues get in the way." Mara's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and pain. "I'm not saying we forget about the mission," she said, her voice rising slightly. "But we can't pretend that this tension isn't affecting everything we do. If we don't address it, it will destroy us. We need to find a way to work through this, Cale. For the mission, yes, but also for us." The last word hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken emotions that had been building between them. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted as Mara stopped in her tracks, her frustration boiling over. Her voice, usually measured and controlled, was now edged with anger and desperation. "I can't keep doing this," she snapped, the words sharp and unyielding. Her declaration cut through the thick silence between them, a stark acknowledgement of the strain that had been building for too long. The mission, the constant danger, and the growing rift between them had taken their toll, and she could no longer keep her emotions in check. Cale's eyes flicked up to meet hers, the weight of her words hitting him like a physical blow. He had sensed the growing distance between them, but hearing it voiced so plainly was like a punch to the gut. Mara's frustration was palpable, and it mirrored the unease he had been trying to suppress. "We're constantly on edge," she continued, her voice trembling slightly with the intensity of her emotions. "It feels like we're not even on the same page anymore." The admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, a plea for understanding and a desperate need for resolution. For a moment, Cale was at a loss for words, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being the calm, strategic one, but now that approach seemed inadequate in the face of Mara's honesty. The tension between them was not just a distraction, it was a threat to everything they were fighting for. Mara's words cut through his defenses, forcing him to confront the reality of their situation. "We need to address this," she said, her voice firm despite the underlying emotion. "Or we're going to end up destroying each other." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the unspoken truths that had finally been brought to light. Mara's declaration was more than just a complaint, it was a turning point, a moment that demanded action. Cale felt the weight of her words settle over him, a sobering reminder of the stakes they were up against. Their mission was critical, but so was the partnership that had brought them this far. They couldn't afford to let their personal struggles undermine everything they had worked for. Mara's plea for resolution was a lifeline, and Cale knew they had to take it, before it was too late. Cale looked up from where he sat, his expression a mixture of weariness and resolve. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, but he knew he had to address the issue before it drove an even deeper wedge between them. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice steady yet tinged with the exhaustion that came from the relentless pressure they had been under. The soft tone of his words carried the weight of everything left unsaid, an acknowledgement of the strain that had been eating away at their partnership. He hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words to convey the depth of his concern. The intensity of the mission, the constant danger, and the ever-present threat of betrayal had worn them both down, leaving little room for the camaraderie that once came so naturally. "We're both under immense pressure," Cale continued, his gaze unwavering as he met Mara's eyes. "And it's affecting how we interact, how we trust each other." His tone was firm now, the resolve in his voice reflecting his determination to bridge the gap that had formed between them. He understood that their partnership was more than just a professional alliance. It was the foundation upon which their entire mission rested. Mara's frustration had been like a mirror, reflecting his own doubts and fears back at him. The mission had become increasingly complex, the stakes higher than ever, and the cracks in their relationship had only grown wider. "But we can't afford to let this divide us," Cale said, his voice gaining strength with each word. The mission was too important, the consequences of failure too dire. He knew they needed to find common ground, to reconnect on a level that went beyond mere strategy and survival. Their bond had been forged in the fires of shared danger, and it was that same bond that would see them through the trials ahead, if they could reclaim it. Mara's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, anger, doubt, and a glimmer of something softer, something that hinted at the connection they had once shared. Cale's words were genuine, and she could see that he was making an effort to reach out, to mend the rift that had formed between them. But the walls she had built up in response to the betrayals and the relentless stress were not easily torn down. "We need to find a way to work through this," Cale added, his voice carrying a quiet urgency. He leaned forward slightly, the movement small but significant, as if trying to physically bridge the space between them. "For our sake," he continued, his eyes locked onto hers, "and for the mission's." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to ease, if only slightly. His plea was not just for their partnership but for the success of everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed. He was offering a lifeline, a chance to address the unspoken issues that had been festering beneath the surface, threatening to derail their mission. Mara remained silent, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts and emotions. She had been so consumed by her own frustration and anger that she hadn't fully considered how it was affecting Cale, or how it was jeopardizing their mission. Cale's words had pierced through the fog of her anger, offering a moment of clarity that she hadn't realized she needed. The weight of their situation pressed down on her, but alongside it came a renewed determination. She could see that Cale was right, that they couldn't afford to be at odds with each other when the stakes were so high. Finally, she nodded, a slow but deliberate gesture that signaled her willingness to try and move past the tension. "You're right," she said softly, her voice less harsh now, more reflective. "We can't let this divide us. We have to figure out how to work together again, how to trust each other." The admission was a significant step, a crack in the armor she had been wearing for too long. Mara knew it wouldn't be easy, that they would have to navigate the scars left by their recent experiences, but Cale's resolve had sparked a determination in her to at least try. Their conversation marked a turning point, a tentative but essential step toward mending the rift that had slowly formed between them. The tension that had been building for days now found an outlet, and with each word exchanged, they chipped away at the wall of frustration and misunderstanding that had been growing. It was a delicate process, fraught with the risk of reopening old wounds, but it was also a necessary one. As they talked, the harsh edges of their anger began to soften, revealing the deeper fears and concerns that had been driving their recent conflicts. Mara spoke candidly about the pressure she felt, the overwhelming responsibility of their mission, and the way it had begun to erode her trust in their allies, and even in Cale. She admitted that her sharpness and impatience were symptoms of the anxiety that had taken root in her mind, making her question every decision, every alliance. As she voiced these thoughts, she realized how much she had internalized her fears, letting them fester until they clouded her judgment. It was a relief, albeit a painful one, to finally bring these feelings into the open, to confront the ways they had been affecting her actions. Cale, in turn, opened up about the immense strain of balancing his royal responsibilities with the demands of their mission. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed and strategic, but the relentless challenges they faced had pushed him to his limits. The strain of maintaining that composure, especially in the face of Mara's growing impatience, had left him feeling isolated and disconnected. He acknowledged that his attempts to stay calm and calculated might have come across as cold or dismissive, exacerbating the tension between them rather than alleviating it. Hearing Mara's concerns allowed him to see how his approach might have unintentionally contributed to the rift between them. As they shared their frustrations and fears, a new understanding began to take root. The conversation wasn't just about airing grievances. It was about recognizing the human element in their partnership, the vulnerabilities that had been laid bare by the extreme circumstances of their mission. Both Mara and Cale began to see that their conflict wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a testament to the immense pressure they were under. This realization allowed them to start viewing each other not as adversaries in their disagreement, but as partners who were struggling with the same burdens. The path forward was clear. They would need to rebuild the trust and unity that had been strained, fortifying their partnership against the external threats that loomed larger than ever. They knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. The challenges they faced were complex, the enemies they fought against cunning and ruthless. But this moment of honesty, of laying bare their fears and frustrations, had rekindled a sense of solidarity that had been missing. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a crucial step toward regaining their focus and cohesion. With this renewed sense of understanding, Mara and Kale turned their attention back to the mission at hand. The stakes were higher than ever, and the dangers more immediate, but they faced them with a newfound determination. Their partnership, once strained to the breaking point, now felt more resilient, tempered by the honesty they had shared. They knew that their bond would need to be stronger than ever to navigate the treacherous waters ahead, and that would require constant communication and a commitment to supporting one another, even when the stress of the mission threatened to drive them apart. As they prepared to move forward, the tension that had once clouded their interactions began to dissipate. The conversation had cleared the air, allowing them to refocus on the task ahead with a clearer mind and a stronger sense of purpose. The challenges before them were daunting, but they were no longer facing them alone. They had recommitted to their partnership, understanding that their greatest strength lay not just in their individual abilities, but in their ability to work together, to trust each other when everything around them seemed uncertain.